just going to put this on the floor.
Yeah.
Hey everybody, it's Tom, and I just wanted to very quickly address a slight error in the forthcoming interview, where instead of Bannon, we say O'Bannon with regard to Steve Bannon, Donald Trump's recent appointment. I apologize for that oversight. Otherwise, I do hope you enjoyed the interview, and I'll catch you guys on the other side. Hey everybody, it's Tom, and this week we are coming to you with the inimitable Timothy Sean Quinn here at Xavier University, and actually, as you guys know, try to avoid being unduly topical. However, in light of the significance of recent events, I thought we would maybe look at a deeper level as to the implications of the recent presidential election with Donald Trump evidently the president-elect of the United States. And so just to come out of the gate with that consideration, let me just go ahead and turn to you, Dr. Quinn, and what are your thoughts there as to the implications of his election, or maybe not implication, but well, say what does that reflect about the condition of American culture?
It's a complicated question, because I think it will take a while to be able to answer that with any real accuracy. But there are a few things that I think occur right off the bat. Here's one thing that actually a colleague of mine was saying a couple of weeks ago, that this election shows the absolute failure of what we do here in the university, which is a harsh judgment about us. But, especially in my case, teaching political, and having been a student of political philosophy, as you know, for the last 40 years or so. And then seeing this, I have to wonder about how efficacious my teaching has been over the years. Now, I'm not about to poll my ex-students, to see who they voted for. But it makes you wonder about education in this country more broadly, and the ability especially to reflect on political things with some degree of cogency, overcome or be able to objectify one's judgments and not simply vote from the gut constantly, but to consider the common good beyond that, to engage in civil discourse. The one thing that has struck me in the last couple of weeks, and a number of my students have noted this as well, that the thought that intelligent people can disagree has disappeared from public discourse entirely. The level of aggression on both sides has been really astonishing. And of course, Trump tapped into aggression in a way in the run-up to the election, right? It was liberating forces and a kind of speech that had not before been liberated to this degree. And post-election, over the last week, that has continued. There have been many calls, of course, for Trump to make a statement demanding that the rhetoric of his supporters be toned down. That would be a good thing were it to happen. And it apparently did, I guess, in the 60 Minutes interview, I think, something like that. I didn't see that interview. Mild, yeah.
In my view, administration. He told them to just, quote unquote, knock it off. But, I mean, then he says that with less than commanding vigor, and on the heels of saying it, appoints
O'Bannon, right?
Who's notorious for,
inciting just that kind of talk. That sort of talk is utterly divisive. Democracies are fragile things on a good day. They're held together, and not simply by force of law, but by a kind of devotion. I've been teaching Spinoza lately in one of my classes, and Spinoza makes this point about liberal democracy rather potently, that coercion by governments is not what holds a democracy together, since a democracy represents really some kind of common agreement, a common will about the nature of the good and what human beings desire or ought to desire. There has to be devotion to those aims that supplement sheer obedience to law,
right.
And that whole sense of devotion seems to, and respect for other citizens by virtue of the fact of their citizenship, it seems totally evaporated,
Your remarks put me in mind, I think it's Whitehead, who, Alfred North Whitehead, said that the real movement of progress, if you want to use that word, which is a freighted word,
Sure.
is characterized by a movement from force to persuasion
Yeah.
as what's really driving culture, and this is connected intimately with freedom. What is freedom in earnest? Falling back into reactivity and divisive politics and language of that variety, it's simply antithetical to the realization of those terms, right?
Right.
So, what is to be done? I guess.
Well,
is
that's
the
a good question.
Which arises. It's very tempting to write off people, for instance, who voted for Trump, which apparently was roughly 50% of the people who voted. So even though, but that's a whole other issue, the popular versus
Right.
the electoral college.
Right.
Abstracting from that for the moment, what is going through their mind that they're going to resonate with someone like Trump?
I really think is just talking to students and talking to others and reading papers and such. My impression it's actually a variety of things. You have, of course, the segment of racists, anti-Semites, the O'Bannon people. But most of the people I don't think are in that position. Middle class in this country has gotten a pounding for the last several decades, and you think about it. About 8 years ago, a political upstart defeated two establishment candidates, one for the Democratic primary and the other in the presidential election, namely Obama. Now he became part of the establishment, and the other upstart candidate, Trump, got elected. It seems that they're not voting for him. They're voting for what he represents in their minds, which is not business as usual. What does that actually mean? For a large segment of Trump voters, as I understand it, is a restoration of middle-class values and middle-class economic opportunities, a restoration of the possibility of manufacturing jobs back in the cities. That's why, curiously, the union vote, the people who Reagan got behind him, the blue-collar Republicans and Democrats, and who the Republicans subsequently lost, have drifted back now to Trump. I don't think they like Trump or even think that much about Trump. They think about the thing that he promises, and they fixate on that one thing, evidence of that to me is that they never asked how he was going to do it. He said, I'm going to do it. Well, do what? A part of their concern has to do with emigration and losing jobs, so that became a thing for him, right? And so we could appeal to a certain anti-immigrant status, or rather anti-immigrant sentiment in the country, in parts of the country. I don't really think that many of his voters were, in fact, racists and anti-immigrant for that reason. It was purely economic. Sort of what happened. All I've been thinking about the last couple of weeks is the 19th century and a couple of events then, with the rise of the Know Nothing movement aimed against Irish immigrants, who people were afraid would take jobs away from the good white Protestants of the North, and the votes of the Irish bishops, actually, during the Civil War, who supported slavery, because for the same reason. They were afraid that if slavery were legal in the country, then there would be danger to jobs among the Irish immigrants who had just come.
So,
defense of one's own against perceived economic threats from anonymous outsiders seems to have animated a certain portion of the electorate. Now, I think it's completely false, by the way.
Right.
It misunderstands the character of immigration. It misunderstands who's emigrating. It is just wrong on a lot of levels. But it seemed to speak to people. It just suggests something about profound frustration with their circumstances at this juncture. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, it's just as you were speaking, a few different things come to mind. The one is when you're talking about political upstarts and how even 8 years ago there was a sense of wanting to depart from quote-unquote business as usual that was leveraged by Obama. But to bring it back to this election, and you said upstart, and then you were alluding to Trump, but I actually thought you were going to go in a slightly different direction, and that there was another
Yeah, Bernie.
Bernie Sanders,
Yes.
who was, as now seems convincingly the case, actually, blackballed is.
Yeah, no,
You
I
know,
know
the,
what you mean.
the
Sure.
DNC seem to have gone out of their way to work against his candidacy.
Yeah, exactly so.
Yet, in all likelihood, if I think Sanders had been the candidate, well, you never know.
It's hard to know.
It's hard to know.
But it would have been an interesting race then, because both those candidates, Trump and Sanders, appeal to a similar kind of dissatisfaction, although that's a dissatisfaction that moves in rather different directions. And it might have actually been able to distinguish those economically dissatisfied from the people who were more problematic, the racists and company, who might have followed Trump, and sorted then the people, the economically frustrated, who might then have voted for Sanders. Sanders could have won in that case. Now that's maybe a pipe dream on my part, but it's an interesting thing to consider, because it reveals something about the electorate at this time.
Again, you don't want to get. I mean, you can always get. I mean, the polling is on your side, but how useful polls are is highly debatable.
Right.
What I was thinking about is, when you consider the fact of divisiveness and lack of discourse in the American conversation, I'm wondering if, in part, you can ascribe the shunting of Bernie Sanders to that phenomenon, where the DNC felt, a kind of siege mentality, which led them to dig in with Clinton.
Sure.
It's just another perhaps symptom of this underlying problem of establishing conversation. What are the rules of conversation? And that also connects to the issue of devotion.
Yeah. I'm impressed by the scope of alienation in the nation now, and it frightens me. It's pervasive. I've never seen the country like this. The closest I remember is when I was a kid in the 60s, and the country was riven over civil rights issues and various other things. It was a complex decade, and a violent decade. War overseas, war at home. We don't have a war at home at the moment, and yet things feel similar, as if the social fabric, the social contract, was getting tossed in a way. That's what I feel when I talk about alienation. The sense that people don't feel that they belong to the same republic. They don't even think of this as a republic anymore. They have their own agenda, their own way of life, their own identifications. They don't feel a part. They don't feel a community. Without that, again, as I was saying before, democracy is fragile. It'll come apart, because the United States, unlike other countries, is not really a nation. There's no natus, there's no nature that, no ethnos that binds us. We're all immigrants here.
Right.
Hence the peculiarity of the anti-immigrant sentiment, but that's another issue. Well, it's a related issue. But we need other things to bind us together. We don't have a common ethnos. We don't have a common language. We do have a common, presumably, dedication to certain principles. Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address says, "We are dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." It's an interesting statement, because it's a revision of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson writes, he asserts baldly that all human beings are equal, are created equal. By Lincoln's time, it's clear that we haven't lived up to that. So we have to rededicate ourselves to it as a proposition to live up to. We're still living up to it, but it seems that thought has lost, has become effaced, really, in this past election. We had one candidate who couldn't make an account of why we should vote for her, and another candidate who was simply unhinged rhetorically. It was an awful spectacle. One of the worst things I've ever seen.
It's frightening, and I wish I could resist your assessment, but
I wish I could too. I'm open to another one.
It does seem that there is a kind of ennemi, right?
Sure.
And it was interesting that you alluded to the Know Nothing movement and the historical precedents, and I'm just wondering if you can see any point in history, whether American or otherwise, upon which one could draw for some encouragement in the face of recent occurrences.
Yeah, that's a good question. Without wishing to be overly romantic, which this might be, my answer, that is, you think about the Depression. Think about this is a time of crisis in the nation, profound crisis. And, of course, the end of the Depression was a result of certain economic policies and the threat of war and various other things. But from the stories my father told me, this is the romantic part, I'm basing this on myth,
Right.
that people watched out for one another. They took one another in. They tried to help each other out when they could. There was a sense that we were all in this together, and it was equally horrible for everyone. Now that's a rather bleak way of reestablishing a sense of human connection. And then, of course, the war that followed reestablished that, cemented that in place. I remember my father telling me the day after Pearl Harbor, he was driving with his father in downtown Cleveland, and he said the line out the recruiting door was like a couple miles long. Just the sense of outrage, of course, that bound the nation together, committed itself to this war, was already prepared for by the kind of cooperation I think one saw in the country during the Great Depression. People, however skeptical they were about government, were not skeptical about one another. That's the other thing about the United States too, that I've been telling students to try to give them hope. But I think this is not a myth. The United States is unusual in being one of the probably the only country where volunteerism has historically been enormously prolific. Even from the beginning of the 19th century on, and it was sponsored and encouraged, of course, by churches. But the rate of volunteerism has always been conspicuous in this country. There's no other country with a record like that. It's really quite something, and it's spontaneous. And it's not provoked by the government. It's not a function of legislation. It's a function of a kind of fellow feeling that still seems to be in place here. It can be tapped into. I don't want it. The current election would suggest that it has eroded substantially, but it's still at work. You don't want a catastrophe to have to, bring it back. But I think it's still here in germ. I'm hoping, at least.
I think that's a salient point, and it is encouraging. It's interesting that you brought up the Depression and how a sense of human solidarity was operative to help people proceed through and ultimately extricate themselves from its jaws, because that's so proximate in time to the rise of fascism.
Sure.
On the other side of the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a differential upon which to perhaps muse, because I'm actually chary to call Trump a fascist outright. It almost seems like he doesn't deserve the kind of dark dignity of that label.
Well, it sells Hitler short, for one thing. Hitler was really much, much worse.
Right. So, probably Mussolini's closer to the mark if you wanted to create an analog. But what was the difference there? Why is it on one, I guess you could say it's the economic conditions in Germany at the time that they conspired, or what do you think?
You mean,
in terms
do I think Trump is a fascist? Or
well,
that he leans that way?
I think even if he himself is not personally a fascist, he is being harnessed by elements that resonate with some kind of proto-fascism.
He's harnessed by a few different elements, because he himself, as far as I can tell, is a man without any profound convictions whatsoever. Unlike Hitler, who was a man of very profound convictions. By virtue of the fact that he doesn't have profound convictions, he can be manipulated. Now, right now, he has, O'Bannon seems to be the bad guy here, and there are other forces operating in the Republican Party that are much more moderate and wish to get his ear and try to moderate him. And you look at the curious opposition in his candidate, Reince Priebus, who speaks for establishment Republicans, and then O'Bannon, who speaks for the alt-right. They're not going to get along. One will end up leaving, I think, within the first year. My guess is actually that it's going to be O'Bannon, and I think that I'm going to make a prediction. He's going to end up saying something so utterly scandalous that Trump will have to lose him.
Yeah.
But that will upset then that constituency in Trump's, in Trump's camp. That'll have two effects. Either Trump will be substantially weakened politically, which could very well happen anyway, or what I think is more likely is he's going to be unable to make good on the promises he seemed to make to those people to get him on his side in the first place. Why he wanted him on his side is beyond me, but there you have it. The wall is already a fence. I'm waiting for it to become a split rail fence. You can just kind of sneak through. He's watering down all those promises because he knows he can't make good on them. Now, if anybody had thought for 2 seconds, they would have been able to figure that out, that his proposals are economically unfeasible. Nonetheless, you don't have to say a lot to get people on your side. Democracies, and Thucydides makes this clear, right? Democracies are always prone to demagogues. And that's what this guy is. He's a demagogue. Hence his affinity to fascism, I think. But I don't think it goes much deeper than that, because I don't think he wants national control of things. In fact, he tends toward a kind of decentralization of economic authority. So economically, he moves in an opposite direction from fascism. Also, fascism, while a populist movement like Trump's movement, supported the middle class, so Trump doesn't really he seems to have tapped into the middle class. I think he's more interested in supporting the trickle-down economics is going to enrich the people at the top, famously. So he's out of sync with the procedures of fascism, but in his demagogic rhetoric resembles them, and especially the degree to which he plays the race card. That's really, but even that's complicated. He himself does not express particularly anti-Semitic sentiments. His daughter is Jewish. The state of Israel is 100% behind this guy. I've been reading the Jerusalem Post. I read it daily. And they think, well, he'll help us against Iran and various other sources. It's O'Bannon who's the anti-Semite. He seems pretty clearly to be problematic in these cases. And then those of Trump's supporters that are attracted to that sort of thing. And because we're seeing it in just popular expressions of anti-Semitism, as if Trump is, in fact, Hitler-like, when in fact, I don't think he is. And they're going to be sorely disappointed, at which point Trump's going to be in severe danger politically. Which is fine with me, by the way.
Right, right. No, I mean, those are important distinctions which haven't been widely made, and I think deserve a greater voice, right? There's a greater subtlety of analysis there. And the particulars matter, details and distinctions matter.
Yeah, I agree.
And
that's why the knee-jerk reaction, both for him and against him, I find problematic, because then we can't diagnose what the actual problem is. This is going to require very careful analysis, I think, to figure out what this represents.
And then, I guess what concerns me is the question of, and this may be putting it too dramatically, the legitimacy of the American political system. Now, what we've sort of gotten into is some of the minutiae of what's operating, say, with Trump's ascendancy and so on. But more generally, and in part maybe his ascendancy is a symbol of this problematic situation. What you look at is a political structure that is forwarding policies that consistently seem to be at odds with the common good. And
are they at odds with the common good, or are they at odds with what different constituencies in the country perceive to be their good?
Well, I would say that the answer to that question is both and.
Mm-hmm. Now,
it's, I think, relatively straightforward to establish that the policies forwarded by the American political structure are at odds with what all sorts of constituencies seem to be seeing as the good,
So what do you have in mind in particular?
Well, you can look at the military aggression of the American government, its involvement in Mesopotamia, as it were, and elsewhere. This is we are now effectively in a condition of perpetual war,
Right.
which does not seem to me consonant with anybody's ultimate good, except for a very narrow segment of the population.
Sure.
And that connects to geopolitical questions and also fossil fuel and all that, which is another major concern, is that we're looking at, due to various ecological pressures, the need to confront, not just as an American nation, but really the human species as a whole, different strategies in terms of how do we generate energy.
Right.
And we need to move toward those strategies very aggressively, but as far as I can tell, the American government is one of the great obstructors. And that's been just as true under Democratic as Republican administrations. So that doesn't...
Yeah, I don't entirely agree. I think that the American government as such doesn't necessarily stand in the way of certain things. I think the way it's structured, the two-party system and such, allows a kind of stasis on these issues to occur, so that the government doesn't have a position or an opinion. It has a few that are in competition with each other that stall any kind of concerted effort on behalf of let's say, climate change, environmental issues especially, I think. And proof of that is, Trump's promise to restore coal power, which is alarming in its own way. There have been times in the nation when, of course, it was able to marshal agreement about certain things. Those times have been fairly rare, if you think about it. I think, World War II, that was about it, I think, and I think of some of the WPA policies that Roosevelt instituted to get us out of the Depression. There seemed to be concerted, or common agreement about some of those things. But even common agreement about World War II was gradual, because the country was basically isolationist at the beginning of the war and had to be dragged into it in certain various ways. Agreement is not what characterizes the democracy. We have a sense of a common good without the necessity of absolute agreement. The founders set it up that way in order to stall change. If everything works according to the Constitution, nothing ever happens. Nothing ever progresses. No legislation ever changes if the system of checks and balances actually works out. Obviously, that's a problematic situation. But on the other hand, the goal of it is to force a kind of circumspection. Now, what's happened, I think, is that we've overshot the mark in this case, and through legislative gerrymandering are able to change the character of the House of Representatives and various other and the Senate, so that you can have you don't just have a system of checks and balances. You have out and out obstructionism. That's why I don't know what the opinion of the American government is as a whole, because it doesn't seem to, because the American government is not one entity, nor is it one person. There seem to be various constituencies with various agenda that have come into collision in a way that has prevented any substantial grappling with very, very serious and global problems.
Well, it sounds as if you were designating the issue as one of stagnation that arises.
Well, I think that, I think that's one problem. But it's a stagnation that's involved, that also involves convincing people that there's a problem in the first place. I was talking to a very intelligent person the other day, a very learned person, who's convinced that the climate change thing is wildly overblown.
Well, I mean, there are arguments on both sides of that equation. But I guess I'm inclined to resist the notion that the American government is that passive.
Well, I don't think it's passive so much as it's not a single entity.
There never the. It seems to me that there is a kind of integrity,
Mm-hmm.
at least to its foreign policy initiatives, where you have these military
Mm-hmm.
adventures which are actually can underwrite not just reliance on fossil fuels, but also particular
Right.
currency arrangements
Mm-hmm.
that are in line with the word that has been in vogue now for a bit, a kind of neoliberal
Right.
understanding of what's best, both for capitalism and also for America. The notion that there is an American exceptionalism.
Oh, right, sure.
And the constellation of those commitments,
Mm-hmm.
I think, do represent a basis upon which you could posit
Mm-hmm.
that there is a degree of singularity about what is coming out of the American government. I say a degree,
I see what you mean.
obviously.
Yeah.
We're speaking in brushstrokes here.
Yeah.
Okay. And my concern is that when you have people like Trump or Clinton on the other side of the equation,
Mm-hmm.
this is very, very much theatrical.
Yeah.
And very much actually sort of obscures this underlying logic, which marshals the military and economic might of the
Mm-hmm.
American government
Mm-hmm.
to serve a very narrow stratum of the population. So, I mean, that's when I say
So you're saying the government uses the military to enrich the top 1%?
right.
I don't believe that. I just think that's false.
Okay.
I think that's not to say that the top 1% is not enriched by certain military actions. I mean, it was Eisenhower in the 50s who warned of the military-industrial complex, and he knew what he was talking about, and it's only grown more intense over the years. But it's different I think there's a distinction between that happening and calling that an intention of the government to bring about. I don't think that that's true. I see no evidence for it. I see the logical connections that you're making, but I'm not persuaded that that's actually an explicit decision on the part of all levels of government to collude in this particular enterprise.
Well, I mean, I think that upon the point upon which that turns, and unfortunately we're running up against time, it's just vexing because this is just
So is the nation.
The question is who is inhabiting the posts, who is in
Right.
power, okay? And
Right.
when you look at the people who are actually in power,
Mm-hmm.
there's this overlap. There's this
Mm-hmm.
that suggests that it's more than just coincidence. And it's not just the 1%, by the way. The 1% is a
Mm-hmm.
very nice term,
Yeah.
right? It's a draws to an issue of class relationship.
Sure.
And
Well, at that point, it looks like Hillary was worse off than Trump, would have done more damage than Trump. He must be a Trump supporter then, because he's at least a populist.
well, now I know you're above those kind of those
No, I'm
false
teasing.
dichotomies.
I'm
Yes,
obviously teasing. Yeah.
So, oh goodness. But here's what we can draw out at this point,
Sure.
which I think is perhaps useful,
Mm-hmm.
since we're running up against time, because obviously we can't resolve this issue
Yeah.
in short order. But what is clear is that we're having a civil conversation,
Yes.
which has within it significant differences,
Mm-hmm.
and yet neither of us are now suddenly moved to violence or,
Because neither of us believe that we know everything, and so we're in a position to try to come to some kind of common understanding. That's
Right.
what's lost in the nation now, and that's what frightens me so much.
And so how does this relate, maybe we can close on this note,
Uh-huh.
to the humanities and re-injecting a commitment to, how do the humanities engender that, and how do we bring them back on board?
Good question. The humanities, I think, if properly studied and if properly lived out, are the heart and soul of freedom of speech. The great books that communicate the humanities to us manage all not to disagree, not to agree with one another. You know, in that case, the study of the humanities requires conversation among friends about the most important things. We will invariably disagree, but without the humanities, frankly, if that dies in the universities, it dies in the country. Everything is at stake in the preservation of the liberal arts. I actually believe that. And I'm quite worried about the degree to which they've been under assault over the, since the economic decline of a few years ago, and they remain under assault.
Well, it is a grave situation. It seems like I might have to go down to the apothecary and look for some curatives for Chinese curses. Because it seems we're under the reign of one. By which I should explain, I'm alluding to a proverb.
Yes, may you live in interesting times.
This is, I'm not trying to imply any kind of... Anyway, some people might take that the wrong way.
Yeah.
But we'll leave it at that. So thank you for talking.
My pleasure, as always.
And hopefully you guys have enjoyed the conversation, and hopefully we'll have more of these in the near future.